quite the contrary of what we were told it will be. New York is that, also, but that's quite the opposite, actually.
Hi, Anna. I think we should.
Hi.
Yeah, welcome everybody to the final presentations of the second iteration of the asset class, led by Reinier de Graaf with Hans Larsson and Alex Retegan. Before I give the floor to Reinier, Hans, and Alex, I would just like to introduce our guests who will be engaging with our students in a conversation. Firstly, we have Patrice Derrington, who is the Holiday Associate Professor and Director of the Real Estate Development Program at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She is the author of the recently released book entitled Built Up, a historical perspective on the contemporary principles and practices of real estate development. Her scholarship bridges the fields of education and real estate, examining building as an innovative knowledge base for the real estate profession. Excuse me. We also have Christoph. We also have, hi Patrice. We also have Christoph Kumpusch, who is a New York-based architect and adjunct associate professor also at Columbia. He teaches design studios and visual studies courses in both the architecture and real estate programs, where he directs the extraction laboratory. He is also the author of the notable book, Detail Culture. And finally, we have Anna Kockelkorn, who is an assistant professor of architecture at the TU Delft's Faculty of Architecture in the Built Environment. And one of her recent scholarly projects of many is an investigation into the relations between financialization and co-housing. So it's my pleasure to give the screen to our tutors to give an introduction before giving it to our students. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Great. Thank you, Salomon, for the introduction. A short message before we head to the investigation of the students. So welcome to the second installment of the asset class at the Berlage. As some of you in the audience might know, architecture is not only a fantastic investment opportunity, it's also a home for people. And the smart investor knows how to leverage this factor to take a good profit and make it even higher. Around the world, developers have been catching on, and recent years, we have seen a proliferation of thrilling new building typologies that cannot be described using the results as a result of typical function requirements. And the first season of the asset class 1 year ago rode on this wave, and it developed a set of golden rules, a set of best-in-class stories of how throwing practical concerns out of the brief could make for a compelling business case. Whether it's a building shaped like a fish for a fish company, $1 million trailer park home, or a rescue plan for the Greek economy involving the fire sale of its stunning portfolio of islands, we last year looked at all of the ways, the exciting new ways for real estate to take over. This year, the Generation 31 team has been hard at work investigating more modest ways to make a buck out of your property.
So you might struggle with a dilapidated building on your property, and you might think that you might need to get rid of it to increase the value of your land. But what if you turn this dilapidated building into a film location? Suddenly you might discover that you make more money. You might make more money out of it than build a new property. Also, your business might be in trouble and might not go well, and you might wonder what to do about it. Why not get your building or your property Vastu Shastra certified, an ancient Indian set of beliefs, which apparently does miracles to your fortune. And also, you might wonder, looking back in history, what you can learn from the founding fathers of the United States of America in terms of real estate and how to make your city prosperous. Many of this we will just discover in the coming minutes. So we will just let now the students tell you more such advices.
Thank you. So we will be going through these 8 different strategies that we identified. We'll be starting off with Cinemando. You might recognize this scene from Skyfall if you're a fan of James Bond. And definitely all these people recognize this particular scene. This is just an actually unnamed road in the middle of Scotland, Glen Edive. And after this film was released, all these tourists started coming here, and this has led to the surrounding cities needing to build parking and infrastructure supporting this. However, despite all that, this particular scene with the road, this little creek, and also including this car will always be preserved thanks to the James Bond film released. Now we'll move on to the haunted house on the hill. To the architects, you might recognize this as a work by Frank Lloyd Wright. This has become a staple in the film industry, and what makes it so usable as a film site is this particular tile that is inspired by Mayan architecture, but it has this strange, ambiguous, yet unique identity to it that allows it to be used in all sorts of films, from horror to just representing a Hong Kong mansion or even the future. And to a film buff, you might recognize this space as the house from Blade Runner, which is what it's become the most known for. And actually, with the release of the new Blade Runner, this house was just recently sold for 15 million euros. The most that's ever been paid for a Frank Lloyd Wright building. And even within this neighborhood that is in a very wealthy part of LA, it's far beyond the price of any surrounding buildings. However, the power of film can be used even in the slums of India. So this is a scene from Slumdog Millionaire, and this is at the Dharavi slums in Mumbai. Due to that film, there's been a booming tourist industry there as well. Guests can spend around 25 euros to spend a night sleeping in one of these slum houses. And comparatively, it's on about the average for the entire city, even within this type of very generic, low budget structure. And another way that the film has influenced the type of buildings that we see and the value of them is through this film, The Evil Dead, which has led to similar type of buildings being preserved and being put up on these websites as film locations. So this leaning barn that really should just be taken down is being kept up and used as a film site in someone's backyard. And another particularly interesting part about this case is that even the building materials themselves gain value because of the film. So the fans of this Evil Dead film started collecting them, and you can, this is a traveling display that they put up at road shows and etc. However, you can also buy the materials that were shown on film. And this has led to 207 times the value of the average price of roofing, 67 times for the glass, and 46 times the price for a wood plank. And if this continues with this type of numbers that come out of this, I think soon everyone will be sourcing FSC materials for their building projects in the future. let's move on to the Vanishing Act.
Hi. So after moving on from the cinema, we're here to question the context. So what about the context? Because the value of real estate has been location, location, location since time immemorial. And it's that ethos that enforces a fear that a new building addition may actually destroy the location itself, or even worse, decrease its value. And therefore benefiting from the location, at the same time, runs an inherent risk. And this forms an obligation to be invisible, a vanishing act that goes far beyond simply building underground, and has been embraced by many architects around the world. And their strategies, once broken down, as we can see here, they are rather simple. There are several strategies in order for a building to camouflage itself and apply to different contexts. But what do they try to do, and why, and what is the underlying motive? And what it's really about is the way the buildings derive value from their context, and then the way the context can derive value from this building addition in turn, either increasing it or maintaining the existing value. And starting with the more invisible examples, where we can see how the exterior reflecting the surroundings and the sky can actually increase the value or even create a location, and moving on to somehow vanishing in the landscape by imitating the earth and the context. And vanishing is just one way of relating to the context, but the value, especially in this case, is not determined by the object, nor by the concept, the context, but by this mutual dynamic relation that is being built up between them. Here we can see the Aloni house in Antiparos, where it's a building that is built between two slopes. And actually, the interesting thing is this is part of the Olieros development, and it was one of the first couple of houses that was built there. And after that, around 10 years ago, the land values have risen 3 to 5-fold. And also on top of that, the government now awards bonuses to developers that top their buildings with earth in a similar way. Here, moving on how you can build an underground house in the suburbs, where the architect simply questioned, shouldn't it be possible to conceal a house in an alpine slope in order to maintain an existing value in this case, or to this glass farm here in the Netherlands that imitates the traditional building techniques by printing in glass. Eventually moving on to Ronsam Tomorrow by Renzo Piano, where although it's only 300 feet away from Le Corbusier's church, Piano decided to cut into the slope so as not to intrude to the presence of this, nor the setting of this iconic building that stands there. And the interesting thing about this building is that we have a new addition that actually camouflages itself into the landscape, as we can see here, but it's not to preserve the landscape per se. It's really to not interrupt the presence of this iconic element that already stands there. Also, sometimes vanishing can also be an extractive art, right? Where we keep deriving value out of something existing, even though sometimes we may not have anything to add to it. And moving on to Almere, again, the Netherlands, and really this neighborhood, the Eindhoven in Almere Port, where it's the third experimental settlement that is made here. And this building here is the first of 9 projects that were built in the area. The interesting thing about this building, which, as we can see, it's mirroring its surroundings, is that whereas the Almere port price per square meter is around 2,500 euros and the Amsterdam price is more than double, After this building, the endpoint price has risen up to almost 5,000, really close to the Amsterdam price per square meter, just by creating this relationship with the context. The brief of the competition called for an individual house with a strong relation to its surroundings, really. And here we're moving on to another type of interpretation of the context, where Herzog and de Meuron are reinterpreting the brick and reusing it in order to increase the value with this state motor extension. And finally, ending again in the Netherlands, where the depot actually encapsulates the skyline of Rotterdam, but it really amplifies the context. It's somehow turning it into a postcard. This case is an attempt to pay respect to the context without really vanishing in it. The context is used as reasoning. And one can question when these buildings are trying to blend into the context and right on the boundary of imitating, disappearing, and actually generating a caricature. When is this fine line between disappearing and caricaturing crossed? And in the same way, we could ask, what would our world be like if iconic buildings within the townscape or landscape as we know them were mirroring their context instead of existing themselves or creating something new? We can also ask where this lack of confidence in the new would bring us when another depot could land in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. Thank you.
So, under the title Power of Promises, we will investigate how a suspended promise of profit and growth becomes capable of increasing the value of land. Masdar City, a 6 square kilometer city for 50,000 people, designed by Foster, promised to be the new eco-city that combines ancient practice and modern technology, a rising star that sees growth rate accelerate. King Abdullah Economic City in Saudi Arabia, a 181 square kilometer city for 1.7 million people that promised to be Saudi Arabia's new desert megacity, a new manufacturing and logistic hub for Saudi Arabia that generates a new era of prosperity. Akon City, a coastal village 100 kilometers from the capital of Senegal, and which is sponsored by the Senegalese singer Encore, and promises to address the need for vibrant new community development. It was officially inaugurated on 2020, and promised to be powered by cryptocurrency and actually resembled the fictional African city in Marvel's hit movie Black Panther, a real-life Wakanda. An Imbi economic city in Nigeria, in which it's a 9,000 hectare multi-township in Nigeria, defined as a special economic zone that promises to attract 500 billion in foreign investment and create 600 to 25,000 jobs. It promises to save the future of Africa and serve as the gateway to both regional and international trade. But where is the construction? Is construction really necessary, or it can be to see the economic growth, or it can be replaced by image and rumors? So now we are going through investigate 3 examples. The Flower of the East is the first one. It was a project that launched in 2002, and it was part of a large contract called Gulf Shark, which was to attract investment from foreign companies. Here, the President Mohamed Khatami in the World Economic Forum in 2004 announced deliberating on investment regulations and foreign direct investments. The agreement comes with the German developer company that buys the land for 600,000 euros. And promises that the 2 million square meter land will plan to attract 3.8 billion euros. The project was slotted to include 3 hotels, 3 residential areas, villas and apartment complexes, coffee shops, showrooms, stores, sport facilities, and a marina. The centerpiece of the project is a hotel in the shape of flower, a combination of Persian and modern architecture. Although the project was cancelled in 2007, the news report on the same year that it had already attracted 3.8 billion euros. And in 2011, we see that the second 7-star hotel is ready to open its doors in Iran. But in reality, the land remains empty. And although it remains untouchable, we see that the surroundings are being developed, and in particularly constructed and delineated the gray zone, which is the development. The rent from 65 euros in 2003 reaches the 190 euro. Then we have the Eco City in Dongtan, close to Shanghai, to have housed 500,000 people and suggest a city with hopes of being completely carbon neutral. On 2005, the Shanghai Industrial Investment Corporation hired up a global design engineer and business consultant company. And here we see that the representatives of the project are awarded in 2008 for their environmental proposal. The 1,200 square kilometer land was being sold for 700 million euros, while it was meant to attract investments of 1.5 million in 2021. Dongtan will be energy self-sufficient with all its transport, residential and commercial buildings powered by a combination of wind, sun and other renewable energy sources. And here we see the signing renders. It's going to be the first eco-city that China builds, a utopia of premature birth. The land in the beginning was mainly residential, and the rent price was around 32 euros, the average. And although there were questions if Dongtan eco-city was ever meant to be built, or it is just another example of greenwashing, the plot remains, and although the plot remains untouchable again, the development of the surroundings was profound. The economic zone that suggests the project a city within a city. Here we see the president of Zambia in front of in the inauguration of the agreement together with the Chinese commerce minister. The land, the 21 square kilometers land was sold for 40 million and was meant to invest 578 million euros in 2021. The project was slated to include the industrial zones, residential zones, commercial business core, and open spaces. And here we see a bird's eye view of the business core. And the news, again, they praise that already in 2019, it covered all the investment that it was supposed to. And we see millions of tweeters. However, the land remains untouchable, and again, we see the surroundings being developed. And now the question is, what if Imogen rumors could construct public spaces? So what if in Mexico, for example, in the Texcoco airport, we propose a multi-facility zone which communicates the dream of development in a shining image, but only in order to create, to develop a huge park that is built only in the surroundings. Thank you.
Hello. With Fortune Capital, I'm looking at how commercial architecture is shaped by beliefs in contemporary India through the phenomena of Vastu Shastra and the resultant repercussions on the financial logic of building layouts. So, Vastu Shastra is an ancient Indian system of architecture based on spatial geometry and directional alignments derived from a 9-square grid. The human embodiment in the diagram represents a cosmic man, and the design is developed from the flow of positive and negative energies and was traditionally used for Hindu temples. The shape of Vastu is always orthogonal and remains a square, as it is believed to be the most perfect form of Indian architecture. Modern adaptations led to the planned city of India. Modern adaptations led to the planned city of India, Jaipur, which was the first city developed completely on the logic of Vastu Shastra, where the street network and public squares are connected with each other, addressing that the universe, all things are always connected in the universe. And similarly, modern era projects by architects such as Charles Correa and Le Corbusier have also incorporated modern architecture with the theories of Vastu Shastra. Today, Vastu Shastra's divinity can even be incorporated in your homes. All you need to do is just follow a few simple steps to Vastify your properties. Step 1 is to find a property which has a street network towards the north, east, or the northeast direction, as that's considered to be the most auspicious space. Or the slope in the property should always be sloping from the northeast to the southwest. Considered to be the most important factor in a building, the entrance of the property should always be located in the northeast, as it represents the archway to prosperity. Water bodies should always be in the north, and the flow of water towards the east brings more financial benefits to the family. The property dimensions should always follow length is to breadth, should always be less than 1:2. And the future expansion zone is only possible in the north and the northeastern directions. The southwest should always be shaded by trees, as Vastu Shastra strongly believes in integrating with nature. And as I mentioned earlier, it should always be orthogonal, so curves or angles are not good for Vastu. And the layout inside the building is also completely derived by Vastu, and even the colors are developed from the diagram of the Vastu Mandala. So these are the 11 steps that form this basic layout of a Vastu compliant property. And Vastu provides the opportunity to have a plethora of examples, and it increases the life conditions of a family and solves the problems that these families have. Architects like Chris Precht and Norman Foster have designed buildings, designed Vastu compliant buildings in high rises, but to have a house designed by Khosla architects or Matharu architects, personally, derived from your own horoscope, even brings out more success in your lives. It is also easy to use the laws of Vastu Shastra for all scales in architecture, from a unit level to high rises, or to even a neighborhood scale. And Vastu Shastra is not limited by any design forms. The phenomena of Vastu Shastra today has become increasingly popular and is the new trend, and has become an important filter in real estate websites and property advertisements. This graph here shows the number of properties for sale currently in the major cities of India. And the Vastu properties, as you can see here, are more than 60 to 70% properties throughout India. And the cost for this premium life is just 4 to 8% more per square feet. Architects and Vastu experts today are studied and well versed in the laws of Vastu because they give consultancy for their clients. They study their horoscopes and provide and modify layouts based on the horoscopes of their clients. So it is very simple to design a new house, but it's even simpler to modify an existing house. All you need to do is just shift or rotate a particular bedroom so that you always sleep towards with your head facing the south, or just tilt the entrance porch so that the entrance arch faces the northeast direction and brings an auspicious life. Do you have a property that is currently facing maintenance issues or is being abandoned and is not inhabitable? All you need to do is consult a Vastu consultant, and with a nominal fee of 170 euros per session, he can provide modifications to your house and make it a much better place for living. Vastu is the future to mitigate all problems in architecture by simply believing in this miracle of the ancient science of building. The financial logic of architecture, subjugated by this real estate mutation, manifests completely on these beliefs, in turn shaping the architecture of contemporary India. Thank you.
And from India, we go to Denmark, where another type of wisdom stems from. I'll be presenting together with Ryan. So when Copenhagen announced to pedestrianize their shopping street Strøget, they received criticism from mobilists and business owners, claiming that the decline of traffic would be reflected in their revenue. Less traffic is less profit was their idea. And them saying, we are Danes, not Italians, while creating a traffic jam in the streets was how protests took place. At the same time, the architect Jan Geel started studying Strøget and he started publishing about it. And slowly this model expanded throughout Copenhagen, using New Haven, and it expanded even to become a kind of a model of pedestrianization over the whole world.
How Jan Gel's selling this, studying this Strøget model and try to give his strategy to promote this equitable and healthy city. So his strategy is to, in his book, he says, stop building for architecture for cheap gasoline. So to him, it's the car oriented street is only for auto industry, beneficial for auto industry. Therefore, we need to ban cars from the street, and to give more space for people to walk. It's also promote better climate, with good for society, good for climate, and good for health. And if people spend more time in public space, the public space become more safer and more interesting, and also it gives more social inclusion and to have this democratic society.
So now the pedestrianization model has been embraced in Copenhagen. You see this increase of square meters of pedestrianized areas being added. And since the last decade, the city designed for the human scale has continuously been mentioned in all these livability rankings, such as those of The Economist, Monocle, and Mercer. But if we go to the next slide, the real acknowledgement comes from Jan Gil himself, stating that the Danes have become more Italian than the Italians. So, of course, this also has its effect in real estate value. So, for instance, if we studied 4 types of streets: regular streets, shopping streets near pedestrianized zone, and fully pedestrianized shopping streets, which are up to 16 times worth more than the equivalent type of property on a very different type of area. So what does this look like on the streets? Regular street, once again, shopping street near pedestrianized zone, and a fully pedestrianized shopping street. Just in the context of Copenhagen, there's including the Strøget shopping area amidst let's say, the historic context. And this is where it gets really interesting, where you can see the black flag price tags are the properties directly on the shopping street, the pedestrianized shopping street, which have much higher values than we showed before.
Yes, then before we see how Jangel's strategy to get cars out from this city, now we try to look at this from the real estate value perspective. So the car-oriented street need this parking spot for this customer to get inside the store. Also, it has narrow sidewalks for pedestrian. It means it's less traffic, pedestrian traffic for the store. And also, you cannot maneuver in this neighborhood easily because you need to wait for the cars to pass, and the cars cannot turn around as freely as pedestrian. And also, you need to spend a valuable street level area to provide for parking, entrance to parking. And then if we go to, if the street was pedestrianized, the street front can also use for terrace seating, that in Strøget is increase of 80% of in outdoor cafe seating. And then also the plane will become active. This is also one of Jan Gil main strategy to put the active plane in the ground level. It's also give 100% value higher in the rent value. And also the corner, most of the street will have this high branded store in the corner. And also when it's pedestrianized, the street up to 16% higher in value, rent value. And also there is this international chain store coming to the street, also the affordable one to make sure people that come to there can start opening their wallet. Also restaurant to keep people energized and ready to shop again. And also you could find easily money changer or ATM in Strøget to like fast food restaurant that so the customer never run off the full fuel.
So going back to the quote from the very beginning, a pedestrianized city with piazzas and cafes is something which the Danes previously only knew from their holidays in Italy. While in fact, these places have very much become unlivable due to tourism, some of them. So at the same time, these cities are also not topping the ranking charts of any livability ranking. So what could they perhaps learn something from the Danes?
Yes, you would think if it's all for tourism, you could also put the pedestrianized car into the city to make the city more livable again and bring the price also down and invite more cars into the city. Thank you.
Hello, this is Void as Value. That I will be presenting with Maria. This is the city of Philadelphia, which has 4 voids within the density, which are known as the 4 square parks. William Penn was the founder of Philadelphia, who left England for a practice of his religious freedom for Quakerism. The Quakers believe in a total egalitarian society where everyone should be treated equally. They invented the price tag, which beforehand bargaining was the main method of purchase. So everyone would be able to purchase the same thing for the same amount of price, leaving everyone to be equal. And Wanamaker's in Philadelphia was the first department store to use the price tag for this reason. This is the original plan that William Penn designed for Philadelphia, where you can see the gridded cities along with the 4 squares that are the void infrastructure. And this is what Philadelphia currently looks like today, with the 4 voids being majorly the only voids within the city.
So reveal the main points of development of the city, looking at the financial aspects and take into account for voids. The initial plan was an equal grid with equal subdivision on plots and with the building inside of plots in the middle. So when the city started to develop according to this grid, from the very beginning, it started to fill from the east part as it was access to the city, where there was the main port of the Vera River. And on this stage, 4 voids didn't play any role yet because they were not part of the development area. In 20th century, after the growth of the city, several interventions changed the equal division of the grid and also influence on these 4 voids, changing the value aspects. First, the railway appeared here, making this part of the city more connected to the other part of the country and bringing more value to them. Then as a part of beautification of the American city, the diagonal road was introduced. And later the highway were implemented on the north and east of the city as interstate highway system, making these 2 voids fall in value. So it's the current plan that also developed under the speculation of real estate and the subdivision of the plots. And also here, the 3rd dimension of the city plays an important role. And Jacklyn will tell about this.
So when City Hall was constructed in 1894, the gentleman's agreement took place in Philadelphia, causing no building to be higher than the statue on top of the building, which was a Quaker practice of agreement. So it wasn't actually part of their zoning code. And then in 1987, they broke the height restriction, causing the 4 squares to rise in value even more and having a more variation between the 4 squares. So here you can see the beginning nature of the 4 squares. And you can see how Logan Circle, which was previously Logan Square, has transformed into geometry based on the museums, and Washington Square being a commercial area. And currently now Franklin Square being the least of the 4 squares because of the highway, and Rittenhouse being the most expensive because of the shopping areas and causing high residential prices and rent. So these 4 voids have become economic hotspots based on the increase of the height restrictions within the city, and also these implementations that Masha discussed earlier with the plan that broke the egalitarian Quakerism design that was originally intended for Philadelphia.
With 5 points of architecture that are based on the Quakers' rules. For example, the Green Garden, the rule is to always have house in the middle of the plot, so the distance between houses full equally with green zones. And we decided to imagine what would happen if the Quaker become like a Quakerism rules of 20th century urbanism. So this is the city by Le Corbusier, where we have the subdivided, equally subdivided plots. The proposal of Frank Lloyd Wright, and the plan for just downtown by Pay with the green zone area in the middle of the dwelling. So we propose a strategy of Quakerism with the equal grid and equal subdivision and green voids as approach to change the value cost of the former demolished area or abandoned areas. Thank you.
Hello. From Philadelphia, we now landed at Hong Kong, where the desire of making money collides with the obligation to follow the law. For it's one of the densest living environment in the world, which is the subdivided flats. In 2015, a phenomenon was witnessed in Hong Kong that a single room with shared facilities in a common urban area was more expensive in terms of price per square feet than the penthouse apartment on the hillside in Hong Kong Island, which is a traditional luxury residential area. So starting from 2012, the Rating and Valuation Bureau of Hong Kongese government had recorded that in Hong Kong, living in a smaller apartment actually costs you more than living in a bigger one. And what is more extreme is if you live in a subdivided unit, which is average less than 6 square meters, it costs you way more than living in a common apartment. The mechanism of a subdivided unit has 3 aspects: the rent per square foot, the size of each flat, and the miscellaneous fee. The property owner first divided his property into smaller units and set the rent price per square foot 5 to 10% higher than the regular flats. However, due to the smaller floor area per unit, each flat is still more affordable to normal people or like migrant workers in who move to Hong Kong to find a job. Thus, the revenue of properties has successfully been increased without any substantial improvement of the space itself. Then we move to the one of the most extreme examples, the Chongqing Mansion. Its peculiarity in subdivided flats can be observed in the before and after subdivisions. So this is the floor plan that was designed for the original use. That is 37 units per floor. And this is the unit after subdivided, average almost 300 units per floor. And then here we pick one as an example to look into. So this is how this is the very original design of the housing unit D8. That is cost around 9,500 Hong Kong dollars for this apartment for the four people household. But it got subdivided into 8 rooms. That is each room is significantly cheaper than the original one, but they combined all together. That is already increased more than 50% of the rent revenue. Right now, the average area of subdivided flats is 48 square foot. That is smaller than the average area people have in the Hong Kong prison. So I was wondering, what if we keep subdivided our house until it becomes completely uninhabitable and a purely speculative tool, just like the cryptocurrency in our city. So we cannot actually consume it, and its value is purely come from its place and its irreplaceable in the city. Thank you.
We move to the last contribution called Core and Shell. So Core and Shell examines the relationship between finance and the lifespan of the suspended towers. These structures appeared in 1963 as part of the late modernism and disappeared 10 years later with the oil crisis, after being no longer economically efficient. To talk about this type, we should also know who were the characters behind these ambitious operations. First, a very outstanding role of the engineer in relation with the architect, and then an important role of the developer, who needed to trust the whole process thanks to feasibility studies that compared the suspended system with the traditional one. As you see in these images related to the case study in Madrid, the type needed to surpass many kind of financial crises due to its complexity. When we look to the core in detail and its mathematics, we observe that the geometry and proportions are quite similar through time. But if we go one by one, we can also understand the role of the clients and the evolution of the type in section. So the first example, the Overbeek Tower in Rotterdam, was built for one of the first containers companies in the Netherlands. The huge core allowed to have column-free spaces on the floors and a 2-story car showroom at the underground level. When the second example, known as Telanese Tower, was built, the Mexican Petroleum Institute and in general the oil and petrochemical industry was receiving a great boost. Telanese and an American petrochemical company is settled in Mexico, and the architect Legorreta is hired to build the tower, which you can see here in the section. The section was conceived as a seismic solution and added a huge structural element on the top from where all the building was hanging. 2 years later, the West Coast Center is built in Vancouver to incorporate a Canadian company which supplied natural gas to the huge industrial and residential markets in the US. And this case is the first one to incorporate the parking as a response to the free column underground floors. Later, the Cologne Towers, with an extravagant disguise, the developer you have seen in the beginning, doubles the height from 50 meters to 110 meters and multiplies the size of the parking as a way to show profitability. And finally, the appearance of the Standard Bank Tower coincides with the growth of the city, thanks to the gold industry, and the type somehow represents the prosperity of the country. In this case, the tower is developed adding prefabricated elements to hang the building 3 times instead of 1. What we see in this timeline is that the disappearance of the type coincides with an increase of the price of gold, both gold and oil. After the 70s, the relation between cost and return is no longer compensated. In Spain, the energy cost of pumping and maintaining the concrete hot until the top of the core is extremely expensive. And in Johannesburg, the last example, the new fire regulation makes it very expensive to use steel cables. So we know that the type disappears after the oil crisis, but we also know that when Norman Foster studies the suspended towers to develop the Hong Kong HSBC building, he states that the concrete core needs to be in the extremes and not in the center in order to have a flexible rectangular floor plan and only 2 main orientations which consume less energy. So as part of the research, a speculative scenario is proposed, and taking into account the trend of building more and more slim towers, the suspended buildings could be resurrected to give a new use to the never inhabited slim cores. So the question could be like, what if a new type emerges from the combination of the old suspended towers and the slim towers as a new financial strategy? I think this was the last slide. Yeah, this is the last project. So
thank you, Anna.
We can open the conversation. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Anna, and thank you, team. I will play the role of conversational matchmaker, if you will, between our invited guests and the students. My first question was to you, Patrice. Would you recommend or would you consider including in an educational curriculum principles such as Vastu Shastra and Quaker principles of equality and the fair use of space?
Thank you, Hans. Well, firstly, excellent presentation to all the students. Really a fascinating trip around the world, I guess, and looking at the nuances of value and cost and livability and buildings and so on. Definitely, I have been converted. Vasta is obviously an important feature for us all if all those promises come true. The interesting thing was that the question that raised in my mind was that charges 170, what is it, 170 what, euros for a consultation? Euros for a consultation, right? How was that price determined? Is that a value? Is there a cost-benefit analysis that says $170 to pay for this improvement will give me all of those benefits? So that's one thing with the Vasa. The fascinating thing with the Quaker influence in America was, in fact, that very important clash between the notion of equal strength in negotiations in a commercial transaction. That's what they attempted to do by making the price visible and set. Interesting for America is how that was eroded by various attempts, by obviously attempts to dominate and remove the equal outcome by someone else having an advantage in terms of either leverage on pricing or price knowledge and so on. So America has become obviously very much focused on being a price-seeking transactional economy that is being exported through, very many parts of the developing world. Fortunately, in various countries, Europe and so on, we'll have much tighter control on pricing and so on. And that, I think, is an important economic context for students to understand about architecture, because it is about access, equal access to the quality of the space that can be provided for them. And whether that is played out in terms of numbers or competing with numbers or not is just one of the, I guess, of the tableaus where it is played out. But I think it was a very important one that came through in various scenarios in this presentation today.
How about you, Jacklyn or Masha? Did anything you stumbled across in your research on the history of Philadelphia perhaps stimulate you to think, well, maybe this is actually something we can use today?
Well, I think it's, I'm from Philadelphia, so I think these four voids, it's pretty much the only park space we have except for the one that's in front of Independence Hall. So for us, it's so nice to have these green spaces and this, and the city is so unequal at this point that it would be so interesting to see how Philadelphia could revert back to more of these green spaces and this kind of country green town that Penn had intended. I think it would be a lot more possibly a lot more successful for the city, because in terms of identity in the United States, we're pretty much known to be the first capital, and it could bring kind of a better identity and to the city itself. And I think it'd be better for the population in general. So it'd be quite interesting to see how these ideas could be implemented back in.
Yeah, from financial aspects, like to use this approach to maybe to make avoid empty space like square or park in the middle of the plot that will actually bring you more money in the end than if you're going to build the whole area with buildings, because then it's like to make more driver for value to grow. So I think it can be as approach how to occupy site if it's like more than one quarter or something like this.
I think there's also relation to this perhaps to some of the other projects shown today. I'm curious, Reinier, what you think regarding exactly this aspect of the, let's say, the stories told or the fictions that are told around a project, whether it's a completely extravagant render of a sort of futuristic master plan in Africa, or a film poster, which generates out of what one would otherwise consider just to be an empty, not very valuable plot, and something altogether different, and the total opposite.
Yeah, well, I think it in a way is an extreme consequence that I think in the context of the market economy, to some extent, the discipline of the distinction between the discipline of urbanism and the discipline of advertisement is kind of null and void. I mean, most forms of urbanism today, they're not populations which are shoved there to live in them. They sort of have to attract the very populations that they are built for. So therefore, they're by definition a form of wishful thinking. And in the more global the competition, I guess the more extravagant the imagery has to be to attract the appropriate amount of attention for it to happen. And what I thought was quite an interesting element of that presentation, that sometimes you use that mechanism on itself, that you in a way design a prediction of sorts, which isn't going to happen, but which is going to trigger a series of panics around it, which are in fact what you're aiming for. I'm very interested in the concept of evil engineering in that sense. I mean, in the 1970s, you had cities, and then they planned big motorways right through the middle of the city in New York and in Vancouver. And as a result, neighborhood communities formed, identities formed, remarkable levels of solidarity emerged between local residents, and the community was born. And they successfully in fact, prevented those highways from happening. So if ever anybody today talks about placemaking or a sense of community, I think planning a horrible motorway, even if it has no intention of really happening, is the perfect mechanism to create that sense of community. So I like the perverse productivity of some of the absurd scenarios that surface.
I think, Anna, I'm curious, Anna Kockelkorn, would you like to see ever a depedestrianized Venice? Do you think that a depedestrianized Venice could actually, in line perhaps with what Reinier was just commenting, maybe offer some unexpected benefits, whether in the form of community resistance or not? Do you think also, I'm thinking also of Maria's project, the Vanishing Act, which was studying the sometimes very thin lip service that's played to the idea of a context, of respecting a context, whether it's in the form of trying to disappear altogether of an architectural intervention, or claiming to be using the material that exists there in order to value the context. I'm curious how you react to these phenomena.
I think they're very different strategies. I really like the idea to Danishize, to render Venice more Danish by introducing a big road. I'm always very suspect of these. I mean, there is the suspicion, of course, of these pedestrianizing strategies as a tool for gentrification. I mean, so are parks. I mean, all of these strategies, or all of these mechanisms that are intended to improve the livable qualities of cities, obviously will raise real estate value. And if there is no sort of regulatory counterbalance, they will become an asset. I mean, this is also the goal of this class, to look at architecture as under the exclusive possibility of an asset. So I would like to give the question back to you, as you have conceived this class. What do you want to achieve with these things? Because sometimes I think I read them as they're analytic strategies, like the strategies for the promise that increases real estate value, and so the project becomes a tool for a vision of a future that never happens, but that has an impact on financial imaginaries. And on the other hand, I see, I mean, I don't think that ever anybody's going to build a motorway instead of the Canale Grande. I don't think that this is going to happen. So I think this is more a really violent comment on the accessibility of cities and what does it mean to pedestrianize them. And I really thought that your analysis was brilliant. I mean, what is actually happened and what is the difference between the rhetorics and the financial mechanism behind. So again, I'm back in the realm of the analytic tool. So what is it that you, or how do you see these different strategies as tools? Are there strategies to build or to act in the environment, or are there more analytic mechanisms to understand what is the role of architecture and maybe urban planning today?
I would like to make a remark about the Venice thing. I don't think the group actually de-pedestrianized Venice. I think the group sort of de-watered Venice, and that is something quite different than cars out, pedestrians in. I mean, they in a way replaced one type of infrastructure by another, and you know, in some way the water in Venice originally is very industrial. So I thought it was in a way a wonderfully inappropriate conclusion to an in itself interesting hypothesis, but that's neither here nor there. I think the aim of the studio is to understand certain mechanisms at play, which are normally not very central to the focus of architects. Nevertheless, that play a humongous role in shaping our built environment. And I think particularly the imagery at the end, sometimes dystopian, sometimes utopian, sometimes I don't even know, but maybe ask the authors. But I think they all serve to make something explicitly visible that otherwise isn't visible. And I was actually, perhaps I was most intrigued by the MVRDV mirror bowl planted in the context of the favela, simply because I couldn't decide for myself whether that was totally utopian or dystopian. I was highly intrigued. Does the author care to comment?
Yes, of course. Well, there was this discussion between this fine line, right, between respecting and responding to the context or using it as an alibi, and on the other hand, where is the line between creating a caricature of the context? And somehow this image was to inverse this situation. Let's say what would happen if in a place where there is no real estate value, what would be the image of this place with such an intervention? What is the mirroring all about also? Because we're talking about this, you can mirror in two ways somehow your context, right? The one is to build in a similar way and to build the same building next to the other, and then the other one is to just reflect whatever is already there.
Is that also why your entire presentation was in black and white? Because I mean, anything photographed in black and white by definition becomes architecture. At least in my view.
I think, yes, no, I mean, if I speak about the context again, of course, it somehow makes it more consistent.
Okay, thanks.
Christoph, I had a question for you regarding a couple of the presentations, which you could in a way group together, maybe as opposite poles potentially of a phenomenon. The last two projects, Divide and Rule by Heng and the Core and Shell by Anna, one looking at a kind of, as we saw, sort of increasingly prison-like subdivision of space, to the point where, as Heng speculated, perhaps you can go to a completely post-residential concept of space, where it simply has a kind of an abstract value of a currency that you can trade. And you can accumulate so many units and sell them to other people potentially without anyone needing to live there at any point. And the opposite, if we look, for example, at what Anna was depicting in this history of the rise and the fall of the core in the shell, or sorry, of the suspended tower, along with the hopes that maybe a lot of the very particular projects that have been cropping up, these super thin towers, are maybe simply a suspended tower in the waiting. Many of these towers, the super thins, as you know, have no inhabitants effectively. They're simply bought, which makes them similar to another uninhabited space of a building, namely the core. So why not turn a super thin building into a core and add some more space for average New Yorkers to live? I'm curious, in your view, what is the potential value of exploring these sort of again, on the borderline, let's say, scenarios in architectural design where potentially removing value becomes a way to add another value eventually, and how we can respond to this as designers as well in the actual layouts that we draw or the plans that we make.
Yeah, thanks, Hans. Incredible amount of questions. I don't even know where to start. I'm gonna quickly fly through it. I'll try to be as precise as possible. Also, like summing up a couple of the things that really I think pushed the boundaries today and very extraordinarily inspiring about the class in general when it not only comes to assets and you just asked this previously, that can be designed or invented, but as in so many of the presentations can actually be found. And we see this so much in New York, not even just thinking about the power of thinness or the act of disappearance, but also on a very, very real level right now with, how can public space be claimed through the parklets, right? What happens with cars actually not showing up to the carbon footprint in the city, and you literally smelling the air to be different, all the way to kind of bikes taking over with, I think 15-fold is a study I read yesterday. So I really liked thinking about assets as something right? There was a lot of architecture in all of your super powerful presentations, but what I wrote down was it was always architecture and, right? Something else, from disappearance to, in Anna's case, that kind of intersection with, thinness, which of course reminded me of a lot of other places and cities other than New York that have in fact taken architecture and art and turned it into something that is of value to real estate. If you think of whatever it was called, Torre Satellite by Barragan in Mexico City, the kind of 5 towers that really try to claim that migration of real estate expands the city, but they were actually hollow, right? It's a collaboration with, I think, Matthias Goeritz at that time. But to go deeper into what you I think hinted at, Hans, I wanted to go back quickly to Jin, which I don't know if we discussed all that much at the beginning, with that idea of how can I not only invent or take a location and adapt it for its value, but how can I in fact reuse it and invent it? I think you mentioned the Isle of Skye, Scotland example. Many others, Loch Ness, for example, there's nothing else other than actually a story that then was capitalized on. Or the Leaning Tower of Pisa, there's nothing there other than the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So there's so many of I think post movie set, post LA type of moments that are somewhat invented. If you go back into the Financial Times yesterday and you look at Alexander Eliasson, the Oracle founders kid, that built one of the most and highly valued movie companies over the last 2 years, valued $8 billion now, simply based on buying up physical movie sets, right? And locations, as you pointed out with Isle of Skye, which I had a chance to visit at some point, and you guys are closer than we are right now. It's totally extraordinary to do. All the way to now Hans thinking about that thinness or that act of disappearance when you actually follow what's happening with NFTs, right? Like where you look at like value that doesn't actually exist, that's kind of invented based on an image that you invent. Not so different to, I think, Reinier's super exciting comment about like infrastructure and how it can become like interchangeable or interlinkable. I also, one thing I wanted to add to Maria's presentation, and please don't kill me if I'm like messing up the names here, but what I really liked about your body of work was that you looked at ground, but you could have even pushed this further in thinking about like the many kind of conditions that we interact with, like ground, not just something as you know digging in, which was interesting in an approach that you have chosen, but it also like really like taking that kind of notion of like being under, above, on, and in something. I'm serious. I liked, but also would really hope you would take this further, and like a bunch of you in there also in that context where you say context doesn't always exist. In fact, like most of the time it doesn't. And if you start to think about like prefabricating, what do you then do with context, right? Like, do you also like create context, or do you create context with, in fact, the content? And what happens if that content or program is absent in, like, as Hans rightfully said, a lot of the needle towers that look phenomenal when you look at them, they are engineering like somewhat like masterpieces if you're into it. But they are, in fact, like doing exactly that, right? Like they are somewhat like prefabricated, but they also like create that notion of like disappearance without necessarily adding the iconicness that you see when you look at it rather than looking out of it. That's why also I think the MVRDV example is a really, really interesting one when mirroring becomes part of it, because it's somewhat, they all start to mirror verticality, right? Like, which we assume like the multiplicity of value and finance, as Dr. Derrington also managed to point out earlier, is kind of a display. If you give me one more minute, Hans, I would just highlight and mention like both Georgia's like mustard city, which I think is an extraordinary example as well, even though it was the point of departure. In fact, like when you visited mustard at the very beginning, it was just like not functional, right? Like all the kind of like Foster autonomous cars, they didn't really run the way they were more like kind of, you're going to a Luna Park or whatever you call it, right? It was kind of an attraction, but there was so much that was happening all around it that kind of started to understand sustainability and self-sustainability in a very, very different way. And with Nishi, I believe, and the question about the 9-square grid, I found this project, I think, like phenomenal. It in my opinion, wouldn't have had to stop short or kind of move to the Farnsworth house. That's when you kind of like lost me a little bit. We all love the Farnsworth house. I love the Farnsworth house. But you had like something really extraordinary there in kind of starting with the 9-square grid, which, it's very, very hard to find somebody that like cannot relate to it. But then you relating it to actually something where you find very few people that can relate to what you were talking about, which is a very, very different kind of like contextualization. I was, for example, like I'm thinking quite a bit about Chan Bowery and like a lot of the kind of like application of like Watsujatsu into stepwells and in a way like really starting to think of baolis and like how they kind of like going like down like into the ground, and like that's grid not necessarily being something horizontal but also something vertical, like in the stepwell context could work, would be really interesting. So I was like somewhat starting to like dream and fantasize how could this 11 steps of like architecture and in your case health look like but within the cultural context that you have chosen. Anyway, I'm going to shut up now, but I'm really, this is, you know, it's not for me to say, and I'm very thankful for like tolerating my presence here, but like it is something you should be really proud of. Like you have achieved something, particularly for us now at the end of the semester, like and all the reviews that like we all participate, like that's definitely been a highlight and like totally inspiring. So I'm gonna be able to probably not sleep still thinking about what you have done tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually thought also the question of Anna was very relevant and not easy to answer, as a matter of fact, in the sense that I think what the projects have been looking at are intentionally on a sort of borderline of what one might call an analysis of an existing situation, and let's say a deadpan extrapolation or projection of what this could mean if it was taken to its extreme even farther. I'm curious how you, Anna, would also answer this question if you see these projects between a kind of criticism and approval or let's say acceptance of a situation. How do you respond to that body of work as a whole in terms of forming a kind of maybe a coherent position on the phenomenon that we studied?
It's a good question. It's not easy to answer, and I think what I see here, or what I take, and I totally agree with Christoph that it was really inspiring, and I think that you have done a tremendously great job in picking these examples and looking at them and transforming them into a narrative that questions what architecture is, and that really also requires practicing architects to reconsider their role as agents that transform the built environment. And that's why I think that the whole angle of this class is extremely relevant and crucial. But what is it? And I think that in most cases, and well, not all, but for example, the Vanishing Act or the Power of Promises and the Vastu Shastra, I would fail that in that same group, is really about creating a story around architecture. And it's more creating a story of value building than maybe the architecture itself, in the way the architecture follows suit of what this imaginary story might look like. Of course, I mean, that was also with the Cinemando. And so I wonder if that, I mean, that is also maybe the most close affinity of architecture with the financial imaginaries that are associated to it. And so I wonder if there could be another level, and maybe I don't see it yet, of investigation that is more closely related to the actual fabric. And there I agree that that is in the shell and in the core and shell project, as well as in the divide and rule project, that is more what Keller Easterling might call the coding or the protocols of architecture. And so maybe what I could see here is a more conscious approach. If I consider these as strategies and as analytic tools, as a more conscious decision making on the register on which you operate with the narrative or the kind of analysis that you develop here, in order to retrieve maybe a even more clearly articulated way. I don't know if way of what kind of architecture you are starting to think here, and maybe you develop this further for a publication project, and maybe this kind of different taxonomies between the imaginary, between the actual transformation of the built fabric of architecture, but maybe also the immediate impact on real estate value, real estate valorization of the context rather than the architecture itself. Maybe there are categorizations that might be developed further.
I'd like to invert that. Anna, you're bringing up, I think the crux of what they were looking at in terms of the pieces and the dialogue between, or the dialectic between them. But I really think that what is emerging, or what is being elucidated, is that they are critiquing, rather than talking about the building of value, they're critiquing the belief that value is built with architecture, and by exposing both sides of that, and that is that architecture has value, or is it the void that has value? And then also, what is this concept of value? Because really what was often said was, there was this big investment, or this money going in, or this intention of prosperity, but it didn't happen. And we often do that with architecture. How does that economic process appropriate architecture to do that? Or is architecture appropriating an economic process that does that, that creates this aspiration? I don't know which. I think it's a critique of the dynamic, the dialectic, and I think their search, their exploration, the creating of the frisson between them, I think is a terribly rich exploration at this moment. I think it's a little hard to say, well, what do we then do? I don't think we've made it through the exploration yet, or the critique.
Well, we just put lifts in Vignoli's tower, and we take out the floors and suspend with thin steel wires floors around it. That's what we'll do next.
Good. The only problem is that I think you have a bit of a fire regulation issue there, Reinier, not to rain on your parade.
Sure, yeah.
No.
But I mean, architecture, I mean, I agree that it's definitely critical in the way that it asks for the conditions that make value or produce, or that influence and impact upon the building of architecture as an asset. But there's also a way to think, I mean, the angle of analysis is always putting architecture under the aspect of the commodity, but architecture also exists as use value and as something that is not a commodity. And that aspect is not part of the analysis. So I don't know.
Yes, it was, and it was, very well presented, quite subtly, in the one where we had the Hong Kong apartments being broken down. It was very, very clever. And you're absolutely right, and this is what I teach my students. There's a big difference between the trading of real estate and the value of real estate as occupied and used space by users. So, but they interrelate and they do inform each other. But the limits were wonderfully shown in that you can take those Hong Kong apartments and break them down into smaller and smaller rooms, but there's going to be a point at which there is no use. So this thing does have a limit when we get back to human nature. Yeah. So I thought that it would have been good to sort of express that, hitting the wall about how far you can go. And I think we've done this even in office buildings. We kept squeezing people into smaller and smaller spaces, for offices until we got COVID. And now everyone's saying, don't put us in such small spaces anymore. And so therefore, what does that mean for real estate now? Real estate, because the value of real estate was pushing it smaller. Now, what happens? Yeah.
But I think that the thing is what you see, and I think the projects also bring that out. And in that sense, there is a weird analogy between the slender tower and the apartment division in Hong Kong, is that there is a clear drive towards an extreme. Nevertheless, the extreme destroys the proposition. The unconditional embrace of finance destroys value, and therefore even destroys that which finance ultimately reflects. And in that sense, there is a sort of diabolical, almost Faustian relation between architecture and finance, as that which enables architecture to exist. Nevertheless, the unconditional embrace of that condition of finance leads to destruction.
Yep, destruction of the value. Yep.
Yeah.
No, very true. Very true.
Perhaps Ludo or Salomon, you can also weigh in on this. On this problem, this issue, the Faustian bargain.
The Faustian.
I'm Faustian. I'm sure Lugo has an inventive response per usual for this.
No, give me some time.
So while you're thinking, Ludo, I want to like just a footnote, Heng, in terms of Hong Kong, because we did leave you off the hook a little bit too easy. I completely agree with everything was said about subdivision and the kind of like the greatness and like all of this, but there's also something in terms of like the value of like livability and like the kind of the human contextuality, right? Like, so even though an apartment that's not subdivided, like taking 6 square meters and dividing it up into like, 6 people like living there, like this in your value in relationship to the kind of like net possibility of space that you have access to may just be what you can afford at that point, right? So even though like the argument is like the larger you get and the more quote unquote apartment you acquire, like the cheaper it becomes per square footage, but that's maybe not what you're able to kind of like have access to at that point, let alone the livability of it, right? Like this is kind of like the same conversation we had like in many cities and like also here in New York about like micro units. How small can you go, and like what are requirements like in terms of like having them legal or not? Do I need like daylight? How much daylight do I need? Do I need like air? How much air do I need? And so on and so forth. The other thing that like I would have loved if you push this forward further, and I'm sure you all keep working on those things, is in the Hong Kong context, it's like it's fabricated, right? Like it's a fabricated like need. Like there's enough land, right? Like there's enough land on the peak. Like the government has enough land, right? Like it's just like it's a kind of like fabricated like density. In the context of like the Needle Towers and like New York is just, I mean, there's only so much island that there is, right? There's only so much Manhattan that there is. So the question is like, why do I need to be there and like therefore need like that verticality? That's like one that I think like brings on us like questions in terms of also the social value into play. That is quite interesting. But the Hong Kong one, it's you really I don't know, like I like push this a little bit further and like maybe like going from that like successful idea of like division into like the kind of like maybe another example close by in Shenzhen, just like across the border of like, what do I do when I start to like stretch that fabric, right? Like, and like create these pockets of urban villages or whatever it's called, right? Like the kind of like mega subdivision to like mega density. Anyway, Ludo, that was a long like thought. Man.
Okay. Well, thank you. As we know, footnotes come at the end of the book. So that brings us to the end, I think, a little bit over schedule, but still as a result of stimulating discussion. And we can leave Salomon and Ludo to meditate unresolved tensions for next time.
I mean, yeah, but I was just thinking about these, if it's Hong Kong or if it's Tokyo or if it's New York, I mean, the difference of these minimal footprints is also just, it's not just the real estate, right? It's the design of objects that inhabit that real estate too. So, I mean, if we think about Hong Kong or Japan, vertical toasters, everything has a kind of small footprint and is exaggerated in the y-axis. So it's a kind of completely different kind of lifestyle. So I think it's also, I mean, going back to this idea of context, is this still this question of the generic versus the specific, and how do we start to really wrestle with those kinds of questions. I mean, Reinier knows this as the gentleman Dutchman. I mean, in the 1980s, still a family of 4 in the Netherlands was still living within very minimal square meters. It's only really within very recent years, right, that footprints have gotten much larger. So,
but also unaffordable.
And
I mean, my family of 4 could buy a house. My kids cannot start a family and buy a house anymore. So it's back to square one.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think these are the polarizations that we deal with, right? Even 5 years ago, it was much easier to get a loan. You could basically get a mortgage without a down payment. Now that's essentially impossible. So you could have been 28 years old, just a little bit, there was all sorts of opportunity in this immediate context. Now it's completely done. Over. Well, sorry, that's a little bit of a negative way to end, but I think it's a realistic one, because that's also part of the ambition of this seminar, is to to start to think in these types of questions, right? About what is the meaning of what we do as architects. Anyways, thank you, Reinier. As always, we look forward to the 3rd iteration of this trilogy next spring. Thank you, Hans and Alex. Thank you, Patrice, Christoph, Anna. Thank you to the 10 of you. So for a great semester. So next time we'll be a little bit more back to normal, or the next normal. Let's see what happens. So until